you a home grower looking for a little bit of help? Are you ready to learn as much as you can about your favorite hobby? The Homegrown Helpers brings you informative interviews from experienced growers that have taken the next steps in their journey and decided to help you grow top quality cannabis all in your home. Now welcome in our host, Rob Smith, along with this week's Homegrown Helper. And welcome to the show, everybody. I am your host, Rob Smith, bringing you grow advice, tips, tricks, trials and tribulations from growers, home growers all around the world that want to share their successes and failures with you to help you lessen that learning curve. Today is no different. I am joined from my good friend, Sativa Steve from Colorado. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here again.
Yeah, man. We are wrapping up part 2 today because, as Steve so eloquently put it before we hit record, he was running his suck a little bit, but it was all gold. Like there was a bunch of, tangents that Steve went down, but he really covered a lot of random grow advice from his experiences in the garden and products that he's tried and methods that has succeeded and some that have failed him. So, last week when we talked, and we're going to air these back to back in about a month or so, I think, and we covered your history and a little bit about you and your current grow setup and how you've gotten to the point. You've done a lot of transitions and experiments, and that's really, really cool. And I encourage people to find the grow method that works for them, and Steve is definitely rocking it there. So if you haven't listened to part 1, go back, listen to that. Lots of stuff about Steve and how he got to where he was. We have to thank him for his service again. He's a veteran of our military, and for all the grow advice that he dropped on you on part 1. Go back and listen to that. Before we get into it, we're just going to thank our partner for today's show, and that's Atlas Plant Trainer. Steve is a member at mygrowpass.com. That's our membership program that Jordan from Growcast and I put together, and just to bring some elevated grow knowledge, some product discounts. We also do a quarterly, it's probably $6,000 giveaway now, but along with that comes steeper discounts, and right now our membership is open. When this airs, it's probably going to be open for 2 more weeks. Middle April, we plan on closing it again. So, head on over, grab a mygrowpass.com membership. You can get 3 different levels, the veg, bloom, and content only, which is a favorite of our international listeners out there. But today's show is brought to us by one of our mygrowpass.com partners and my product, actually, in full disclosure. And that's Atlas Plant Trainer. Atlas Plant Trainer is the customizable click-together tomato cage that I designed because I was tired of using bamboo stakes and soft wire tie and tomato cages and all that stuff that everybody uses to train their plants, but wasn't really designed for an indoor gardener. All of these other devices are okay with the plant growing tall to get to a wide shape, where indoor gardening, you don't want your plant to be too tall because it's a wasted energy, wasted space, and extra heat stress can get to your plant with the extra heat buildup under your lights. So, I created this customizable click together solution, that grows to any size and shape that you want. So, Steve, you've used this product before, right? Like, can you share, a brief thought with the audience about what you think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great product on a number of levels. So to talk a little bit about the difference between the APT kit and something like a regular tomato cage or a stake or something like that, in addition to the material differences between the two, you really got to think of how much more versatility you get. With a bamboo stake or something like that, you're going to have something like a 4-foot long, pretty thin thing, and you can't really bend it around in any direction or anything like that. So you got to kind of like stick this thing into weird angles in the dirt to get it kind of positioned right where you want it. Whereas with the APT, I want to say the angles play out at about 10 degrees, like every little click, that you can, move it over.
It's 22 and a half, I think. There's 16 different angles.
Oh, that was off.
Yeah, so it
Yeah.
spins 360, 16. I think it worked out to like 22 and a half, something like that.
Yeah, it's really great because when you first, you can one get that, the little steak piece a lot closer to the main stalk, which gives it a little bit better leverage and just more uniformity in terms of where you're putting everything in. It also, keeps the channels vertical as opposed to horizontal. So, you never know when you get a steak in there from bamboo, horizontally, it can cause channeling issues, which I talked a little bit about on the first half of the interview we did. But just having that flexibility to kind of change the angle, because not every plant's going to be the same. Not every way you train the plant is going to be the same. The internode spacing can come into play here. And just think when you have if you're a guy who likes to do topping as opposed to LST, this is still a good product for that. Just think in terms of like when you're taking, that first top, when you're going out to like, anywhere between 5 and 7 nodes, and then you're kind of cleaning off the bottom, depending on the internode spacing of that particular phenotype or cut or whatever, it can really, I guess, change the way that the lateral distribution of those first branches you're keeping kind of play out. And so just having that flexibility to move those things is great. If it's more of like a 90-degree angle, kind of those first branches, you can work with that. If it's more of a 45-degree angle, you can work with that. I mean, you can get in there early and you can set up the shape early such that you're not waiting for the plant to grow out and get too hoppy or, top heavy before you're giving it its support. You're getting in there early, you're getting in there at the right angles, and you're just kind of working with the plant as opposed to making, the plant move around you, if that makes sense.
Well, nothing better than a true customer testimonial to, really drive home the purpose of the product. Steve is not a paid advertisement for Atlas Plant Trainer, but I certainly appreciate all the kind words that he just said about the product.
Just a happy customer. And, if you're into trellising, you can totally do that too. You can take a trellis net, cut it down to whatever size of, how you plan to use the APT to aid in trellising. And the great thing about that is rather than put a whole net down for your whole tent, and now you can't pull the plants out.
Right.
You can get a couple of, in the hydro grower you had on a few weeks ago, who I follow now. I can't recall his handle right off the top of my head, but
Doctilla's Garden.
I believe he does that technique, and just seeing him do it, it works really well. So
yep. When I designed that product, and we'll wrap it up here, but when I designed that product, it was really to work with the plant training and support devices that were out there, or be a standalone and provide you with everything you needed for training and supporting your plant with just that one product. So head on over to atlasplanttrainer.com. The catchphrase is bigger plants gets bigger yields, and you can grow biggest with Atlas Plant Trainer. Use code GROWCAST, save yourself 10%, or members save 25%. So now that we have completely gone super, super long, but if you've been curious about the product, there it is. Let's get into some grow advice, Steve. What do you say?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good to me.
Cool. So last time we got together, I have a list of questions, and you were at work, and I think you're there again. And we weren't able to get to all the questions, so we scheduled a part 2. So getting to the questions that I had written down, I'd like you to just kick it off and talk about something that we hinted upon last time, but I think there's more to this. And you transitioned a lot, and currently you're transitioning to deep water culture. Is that correct?
So I'm doing an intermediate step on the way to DWC, and that's probably going to be through cocoa.
Okay.
And really the reason that I'm transitioning away from organics is just because of my growth style. I talked about it a little bit last time, how I'm doing kind of like a high speed harvest turnaround,
right,
using 2 to 3 flowering tents. And basically to get the plants to veg out that quickly, such that they're going to be ready for those flower tents on high turnaround. You really need some of those hydro growth rates to get that kind of a thing going. And that's
right.
The only reason I'm transitioning out.
Cool. But, with your dabbling in organics, we wanted to talk about the organic Korean natural farming inputs, and more importantly, kind of troubleshooting when deficiencies present themselves in organics. We're talking about when you mix a soil and then you put your plant in and you top dress and amend, like, what are you doing those amendments with when you do spot a nutrient deficiency, and you're not just dropping some CalMag into a bucket and dumping it on your plant. Like how are you addressing those issues?
Right. So it gets kind of tricky with organics because it is very different from hydro in the sense that there's not as many measurable targets for things like EC or your bacterial count or your bacterial spectrum. We'll use colony forming units, which kind of gives you a rough idea of how many microbes are down there, assuming they all survive and don't die off from either heat or cold intolerance. But when it comes to deficiencies, the first thing you're going to want to do, like with any deficiency issue in any grow system, is try to figure out how it's getting deficient, because it's not always that you're missing something, although that does tend to happen more in organics than hydro, because typically with hydro, you're giving the plant too much. In fact, you'll notice a lot of hydros growers, cut the recommended dosage off the manufacturer in half and then work up from there. With organics, you can run out of specific nutrients because when you make that initial soil, and this is why pot ups are, the timing of pot ups are so critical. Let's say, and it can vary from cut to cut, like one cut might eat calcium a little bit more than the next one, or magnesium a little bit more. So if you have this standard recipe where, you've taken all these inputs and you've ratioed them out for your soil recipe, and two good places of information to do this, if you're really looking for concrete metrics on what you're putting in. Number one is Jeff Lowenfull's book, Teaming with Nutrients. And in the back there, he's got like a whole section that'll basically give you whether, this thing's a slow release nutrient or a fast release. And I think I talked a little bit about that last time when I talked about, whether you're going to have a fungal or a bacterial dominant soil, has a lot to do with whether you're using those slow or fast release nutes. And it'll also have the NPK ratios in there. So you can go on in the back of that book. It's one of the later chapters and find that stuff. But also if you don't want to go out and get the book, you can Google Ross Penhaligon. It's an OSU extension paper that he put out. And essentially it lists, like in a spreadsheet form, all these different things, alfalfa meal, kelp meal, all that stuff. And it'll give you the NPK breakdown. It'll tell you if it's fast working or slow working. So it's an OSU extension thing. If you just, Google soil input NPK register OSU extension or something like that, this thing will come up and you'll see like a 1 or 2 page thing and it'll tell you all about all those different nutrients. And then you got to kind of figure out what ratio you want to tailor and what you want to put in. And when you're doing that, keep in mind, when you're first building that soil recipe, think about, the plant's life cycle, what nutrients it's going to want when. And so, if you're potting up from, kind of your training pot and veg to what you're about to do in flower, start thinking about the transition of nutrients, in the flower cycle when you're earlier on. So if you know that you're going to use a different soil during veg or a different soil recipe in veg and flower, that might be one thing if you're trying to keep it uniform. Then think down the road. Think like, okay, I'm going to pot this thing up when it's in, going from like a 3 to an 8 or something like that. And generally you want to use a bigger pot size and do a pot up right before you go into flower so that it has all the nutrients to carry it through that 2 to 3 month flowering cycle, as opposed to, probably a shorter veg cycle. So make sure you have enough newts in there, make sure they're the right kind of newts per the plant's, natural newt demand as it goes into flower. And then also just make sure you're on top of preparedness just in case you do have a deficiency. And like I said, figure out where that deficiency is coming from first. If it's an issue where you don't have those newts it's looking for in the soil, you can, if it's not too late in the flower, you can hit it with a foliar. Or if it's in veg, you can do this as well. And what I would recommend, and you typically see this toward like the later end of your veg pot before you go into flowering sometimes, is you'll see 1 or 2 newt deficiencies show up. If it's related to lack of soil, you'll see that go away in the foliar spray. And a good general organic foliar that I recommend would be something like a 5-to-2 mix of fulvic acid with aloe extracts, either, like an aloe ferment that you can get. You don't want to make it on your own. You can get them off of places like Well Grown Seeds. They'll send them out to you already pre-made in huge batches and then bottled up. And you can just use that in a foliar at the appropriate dilution with some fulvic. And what the fulvic does for you, it does a few things. It's going to act as a chelating agent. It's just going to help with nutrient absorption overall, both if you use it as a root drench or as a foliar applicant. And it basically makes a lot of that stuff more available, because the other thing you got to remember in organics as opposed to hydro is that in hydro you're given, the plants readily uptakeable nutrients. In organics, you're giving it to them in an organic form, the bacteria or fungus or both, then break it down into an inorganic form. Those little cation or anion groups, your phosphates, your all that stuff. And that's when it can pass through the root's membrane tip. And when you get into plant fizz and how the plant can, basically create concentrations or deficits in certain anion or cations and basically use electronegativity to pull these nutrient solutions, this mixture of, water and nutrients into its root membrane using polarity and things like that, or using active transport when you get into talking about the proteins that get these nutrients through the membrane. And if you read Jeff Lowenthal's book on nutrients, and I consider it his most important of those three, like, you will do a deep dive on that and you will find out exactly how nutrients move through the plant, how they get into the plant, how the soil deals with those nutrients. Because when you talk about electromagneticity, you're also getting into cation exchange, and how much, depending on how much clay versus smaller size particles in your soil you have, that's going to pull certain of these little molecular groups out, your nitrates, your phosphates, and that kind of thing. And so fulvic acid can help unlock those things. And one of the things he talked about in that book that made me change the way I think about not just organics, but nutrients in general was, thinking about calcium and magnesium as macronutrients as opposed to micro. Because if you look at what the cell's building as it's vegging out, you're talking about building chlorophyll A and B. And magnesium is a key molecule in that formula, in addition to CHO, which is, you're going to get that from like your organic matter and your microbe exudate interactions. But that magnesium becomes very important with building, the photosynthetic capabilities. And if the plant doesn't have that magnesium, it's not producing as much chlorophyll, which means it's not taking in as many of those micromoles of light that your LED is spitting out. So, it all builds on each other. And so if you're getting into organics, don't just understand the differences between, organic and inorganic forms of molecular compounds or anything like that. Get into how the plant's using it, when it's using these nutrients, at what points in the life cycle, and start to factor those things into your soil recipe, especially if you're not changing recipes halfway through. If you're keeping the same soil throughout, think about the ratios and when the plant's going to need those nutrients at what points of its life cycle. And for just to address deficiencies as they come up, make sure that it's a missing something issue, and not necessarily hey, I'm running a really hot environment, or my lights are putting out a whole bunch of more micromoles than are needed, and I'm driving transpiration rates through the roof. This plant is sweating, so now it wants water. It's going to suck in the nutrients with that water. If it's spitting all those nutrients out via transpiration before it can incorporate them, then it might miss a thing or two, So make sure it's not that the soil's missing it. Make sure that the plant's not doing anything crazy that's going to alter basically how it incorporates those nutrients. It's not always just pH. It's not always just you're missing something. A lot of it relates to transpiration too. And if that water evaporates off, you're leaving a salt concentration in the root zone, because now there's more salt than water. So think about these things when you see them pop up. If the foliar spray takes care of it or doesn't take care of it, use that data to then infer more about the problem. That's my recommendation.
So I think it would be really helpful if you and I can kind of piece this together, where like you start noticing a deficiency. You said the first step would be to make sure that your environment is dialed in and your humidity isn't too low, so your plants are transpiring. I mean, is that the first thing to look at if you think your plants are having a nutrient deficiency?
Right. I would diagnose the deficiency as the problem rather than going right to, okay, this thing's like missing calcium or something. Start thinking about, okay, why is this thing missing calcium? And then work through like kind of a process of elimination. Okay, it's not that my environment's dialed in, so I don't think this thing's it's a transpiration related problem. Okay, what did I put in last time I watered? Okay, how long has it been in this pot with this soil? Start thinking through all these different things that can give you a deficiency symptom, because it's not always deficiency. It can be lockout. Okay, if it's lockout, is it related to pH? Is it related to transpiration? what's causing the lockout. Don't just look at lockout and say, okay, it's lockout, because the lockout can be several different things, or it can be more than one thing. It might not just be one thing that's causing it. It might be, synergistic effects from two problems. So really think through what's causing the deficiency before you attempt to treat it. Because if you attempt to treat it with a, solution that's not going to work, now you're wasting time. I think about time a lot, and this is why I'm really starting to lean towards low stress training, is because, the more you can cut down on that time element and, just making sure these plants have what they need via listening to them and letting them, give you that feedback. And the best way to do that, frankly, is just to have really good data collection protocols. And I'm talking about, PPD, EC, all that stuff. If you're tracking all that stuff and you're on top of those numbers, that's you listening to the plant. That's you using the best ear possible to listen to the plant. And that doesn't stop in organics either. You know what I mean? Just because we're not watering to runoff, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be thinking about what the root zone pH looks like. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be checking your PPFD at the canopy. All these things are how you listen to your plant, in addition to visually looking at, symptomatic stress and things like that. So that's step one for me, is figuring out what is causing the deficiency and then going to treat it such that you're not wasting time and resources.
So I think that's great stuff, but I think we've, covered the entire answer to this. But if you could give somebody, a 5-step process to determining what's causing the deficiency, what would step one be? Okay. Is that check your environment?
Yeah, I would say, basically go down that process of elimination until you can figure out what's causing that deficiency. Sure, so the checklist would be something like,
let's do that.
Check the environment, make sure the VPD is in range. I would say in terms of transpiration rates, and this is just something I've noticed, I don't know if it's concrete, but temperature has more of an effect on the VPD, or at least the transpiration rates. I kind of use those things interchangeably, but sure, the temperature has more to do with the transpiration rate than the humidity. The humidity is kind of like how much water is there such that it can take more transpiration. So the lower it is, the more room there is for wetness that the plant is sweating out, if that makes sense. So usually I'll start with the temperature, then I'll look at, the humidity, maybe I'll look at the root zone. I'll start thinking about what inputs I put in there. Basically go down that checklist of all the different ways that something could have screwed up nutrient uptake. So that includes thinking about EC and all that stuff in the root zone. It's all linked. So transpiration from, the stomata all the way down to the root tip when it's pulling in water, you got to kind of think through that chain and say, where is this problem going wrong? And so I would start, with the stomata and work my way down. So start with the environment, because that's what's controlling the stomata openings, right? When a plant's too hot, it's going to close those stomata because it's a C3 plant. And so it's not going to release the water, and it's not going to want to take up water, which means maybe it, will start getting deficient because it doesn't open it up. It doesn't transpire because it's too hot to do that. And the plant doesn't want to dry itself out via losing water. So it retains that stuff. And now if you're adding things to the soil after that, you're potentially causing an EC buildup, electroconductivity buildup with salt. So I would really, with diagnosing deficiencies, I would really look at that stomata to root tip pathway that the plant's going through and think out how whatever's going on in your environment, both, above the leaf surface and, into the subsoil kind of area, what is causing this kind of pathway to break down or slow or degrade such that it's either causing a buildup of something or a diminishment of something. Okay. Kind of makes sense in terms of process.
Yeah. So I'm going to try something off the cuff here, and I hope Steve is going to play along.
Sure.
He's already committing. He doesn't even know what it is. I like you, buddy. I like you. Yes. So we're going to create a checklist for you to download and follow along with when you are starting on this organic journey. Say you're using Just So Hum Living Soils. I know Steve, speaks highly of that product, and you start noticing a deficiency. So Steve and I are going to work together before this episode is published and, over the next month, and come up with a checklist for you to download. You're going to be able to get that at thehomegrownhelpers.com/checklist. And it will walk you through like what check your environment. And environment, we mean VPD, but also leaf, surface temperature.
Leaf surface temp. Yep, that's huge.
Yep.
That is a critical metric.
Right. So I'm
surprised I forgot to mention that.
No, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna put this all together and make sure this is a really great resource for you guys to download. You'll be able to get it at thehomegrownhelpers.com/checklist.
And I'll add to that.
I don't even know what it's going to entail. Like a lot of what we just talked about, but we're just going to go deeper and give you everything right up to, okay, it's a deficiency and you need to add, calcium or magnesium in some sort.
Right. The only thing I would add on top of that, and this is a big like new grower, tip, is the way you monitor that transpiration rate. And I'm glad you mentioned leaf surface temperatures because that's what brought this to mind. Definitely get a low end, if you can, par meter and get a laser temp gun, because basically using those two in conjunction, one, the par meter to check your PPFD across the canopy and get it at those target PPFD numbers. You can find those on Dr. Coco's website, and essentially just make sure per the growing phase of that plant that it's hitting those PPFD metrics, and then check the leaf surface temp. And those two numbers will give you a good idea of, in addition to your environmental data, your temp and relative humidity, how much the plant is going to be sweating. So that's really important.
So, I had one question about all this organic farming, and I know that you're passionate about these microbes. How important is a product like fish shit or mammoth pee?
Oh, extremely. It's critical
in these organic gardening where it's activating the things that are in the soil. Talk about that a little bit and how important adding those inputs are.
Right. So, I mean, the other big difference between hydro and organic is you're kind of inserting a middleman between the plant and the nutrients. In the sense that, I talked about those nutrients being in organic form that have to be broken down by bacteria into inorganic form. And depending on the nutrient and depending on the bacterial strain, the nutrient might break down slower or faster, and the microbe might break that nutrient down slower or faster than another. It's one of the great things about fish shit is that is a cocktail of so many thousands of strains of bacteria. So there'll be a little bit of everything in there. And it's one of those bacterial profiles that'll adapt to what you got going on, because as those strains start competing for one another for whatever your soil recipe is, and that'll change from grower to grower, you'll start to see certain strains become dominant because they're just more efficient at breaking those things down. They get more plant exudate interactions. They're just better cooperators, I guess you can say, with the plant's root structure and with those nutrients that are in there. So that's something you definitely want to think about. And also just, flushing from time to time. I haven't seen it, as a real big issue the way that I do with cocoa grows when I'm at the commercial. But, SLF 100, things like that stuff. And that's an enzyme based product, but, stuff that'll, help break these salts down and get them mobile or get them, out of there such that you're not causing EC issues. If you have to do runoff, for that, that's okay to do once or twice, just to keep that soil healthy. But remember that every time you get any kind of runoff in an organic soil grow, you're potentially leaching out nutrients. So it's a little bit of a balance. If you think you have EC issues, SLF 100 is a pretty good organic, flushing agent. And you can use that, but keep in mind that you might take, some nitrogen or something like that out. So
cool. So again, that checklist is going to be found at thehomegrownhelpers.com/checklist for exactly how to troubleshoot a nutrient deficiency, things to look at before you just start adding in more nutrients to your soil.
And it's also, if you do think it's a deficiency, it's also usually generally safer to, especially if it's a micronutrient, to hit it in foliar as opposed to hitting it in the root drench, because that can potentially, cause EC issues and stuff like that. If you want immediate uptake, you just hit it with a foliar underneath the leaves where the majority of the stomata are in the dark period, and the plant will probably take that up pretty quickly. And, using something like aloe in the foliar is beneficial too, especially for that top growth, because they're loaded down with things like auxins, which you're not going to get in a typical commercial solution for foliar applications. So pumping, literally the plant's own, what it uses to promote growth, those growth hormones, you're putting it right onto the plant in addition to the nutrients that's missing. That was just a little extra thing I wanted to throw in there.
Interesting. So, yeah, before we get to the partner read, I don't think enough people do foliar spraying as much as they should. I learned very, very early on that anytime you foliar spray, your plant uptakes all of the nutrients that it needs through the plant leaf surface, the stomata, all of that. And instead of having to buffer it through the soil and through the roots and then get it up into the plant, it absorbs everything right there. So if you're noticing a little deficiency, just a little one, like a little yellowing, try your nutrient solution on a highly diluted level. Get down to 10 to 20% of the bottled recommendations, and try that. Just as a see if it's just an absorption issue. Could be very simple solution. Foliar spraying is by far underused in my opinion.
Yeah, and just going back to that fulvic aloe combo, one more thing I wanted to mention about that is fulvic acid, when it breaks down, is going to give you nitrogen, sulfur, and I believe iron. If not, the iron's going to be in the aloe, and those are three nutrients that the plant really needs in the veg cycle for growth. When you see that new growth coming in and it's looking a little yellow, it's usually a sulfur or an iron deficiency. And so hitting it with that aloe fulvic acid 5-to-2 ratio will really, take care of a lot of that stuff, plus give it a little bit of an extra end kick. Like you said, it's taken up immediately rather than having to go through the root zone and then the plant has to pump it through to the top. That all takes time.
Yep.
With foliar, it's a lot quicker.
So today's show is also brought to you by our friends at Diamond Cut Co. DiamondCutCo.com. You can use the code GROWCAST to save yourself 10% off of their premium top of the line trimming shears. So Steve uses these products as well. So I'm just going to kick it over to him to share his thoughts about these scissors.
Yeah, I went recently from Fiskars to the Artisan model that Diamond Cut Co puts out. Great. The springs are really strong, stronger than my old Fiskars. So if you're used to the Fiskars and that kind of style of grip and kind of like a thinner, kind of short needle point when the blades come together, the Artisan is probably going to be the model that relates closely to those. They also have other great designs. So if that's not really your cup of tea, they do have several other kind of different ergonomic styles that I think a lot of people are into. Plus, they just look really nice, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, they're top of the line. Fiskars were not made for cannabis trimmers. These scissors were. And that's really what it comes down to is, they're ergonomically designed to be in your hands for hours and hours, and high quality steel and, whatever else they're made with, but really great top of the line products. So that's diamondcutco.com. Save yourself 10% off using the code CROWCAST. So if you guys haven't realized, we're doing this entire thing live. I was pretty confident in Steve's ability to roll with the punches here. So no ad reads inserted in afterwards. Hopefully I can remember to do everything at the end of the show that I plan on doing. But yeah, we're just rocking it. Having a great conversation about growing cannabis. So I'm going to let Steve talk a little bit about planning for success. And I think we were going to talk about, kind of making steps with the end goal in mind. And you talked about heat and spacing and a little bit in your intake form. So why don't you just talk a little bit about the planning for success, and then we'll get into some breeding tips or your thoughts on breeding afterwards.
Sure. So I kind of came into this whole thing with a kind of process-minded mindset. That's a bad choice of words, but anyway, I came in with that mindset already, and just having that ability to really start with the requirements, start with your goals. And Dr. Coco kind of did this with some of the new modeling tools he put on his website for lighting and harvesting, which I'm really happy about. But, start with your goals. Those are your requirements, and then work out from there and say, okay, what do I need, to get that requirement met? And it's never going to be, one thing. It's going to be a series of things. And so when you start to think about how often do I want to harvest? How much do I want to harvest? So that whole thing I was talking about in the first half, where I was, kind of like my goal early on was understanding that I was going to screw this up a bunch. And so okay, let me figure out how to screw things up more and faster so that I learn quicker. And that's why I went, that route with, multiple 2x4s instead of a big 5x5 or something like that. Now you can go the same route with a big 555, and that's what Hoda does. So, I mean, if you're popping, one or two seeds at a time and you just kind of rotate those plants out of that flower tent one at a time, you can do the same thing, just with a different footprint. So it really comes down to, for me, starting with your requirements, what are your goals, work out from there and work with the logistical footprint that you have in your home. I'm a condo grower, so I don't have room for a 5x5. I had to break it, I didn't have choices. I had to break it down into smaller sections if I did want to increase my output, per annum. And so that's kind of how I went about it. Now, if I could go back and change anything, I would have applied that thinking more to my lights and my electrical bill as well. Because, I kind of went in with it thinking I was going to, get kind of like the top of the line stuff and just kind of like throw it all in there and let it do its thing. And that's not always exactly how it works. And you're going to find out you're going to have downstream problems, whether it be, like, for example, that whole active to passive air intake thing. I had the impression that I had to change out all the air in that tent every 1 to 3 minutes or something like that. So I went with the active intake, active exhaust, which required me to throw in a humidifier to keep the right humidity levels. Then when I found out, when I went to that new exhaust fan, I think I talked about it last time, but that AC Infinity 6-inch with the little master controls. Now I got rid of my humidifier, I got rid of my intake fan, and my exhaust fan runs like every few minutes just to kick some heat and humidity out such that it's not hitting the thresholds that I set on that thing. And you'll see your e-bill go down a lot. And as far as lights go, yes, spectrum's important. I'm not discounting that. You definitely want to get some of that far red and UV in there. So if your manufacturer that you're looking at for the light, has those, look at those numbers, understand what they mean before you make your purchase. And then afterwards, those things will pay off down the road, especially when you look at the efficiency. When I first started looking at lights, I think PAR was like a big thing for folks. This was when, Blurple was still kind of king and we hadn't transitioned over to the bulk of the companies putting out kind of more white light stuff. CMHs are good for that too. There's a lot of good white light CMH bulbs out there right now, particularly the Hortilux, right around their 4K, and the Philips 4200K. Those are probably my favorite for the CMH bulbs. Yeah, just making sure your system's efficient, making sure that it's going to give you the right heat and the right leaf surface temperature for that transpiration rate, such that you're not having those downstream issues. Just like thinking about the environment you want per the plant's requirements prior to purchasing those things. If you're going to go small with a small tent, think about how much airflow is going to have to move. Smaller volume of air heats up quicker than a larger volume of air. Smaller parcel of air is easier for a fan to move than a large parcel of air. Really think these things out. And, if you have to get out a piece of paper and a pencil, like draw the shit out, you know what I mean? Like draw the thing. And sometimes, when you're thinking about it in your head, it's hard to see the process, but when you start putting it on paper, you really start saying, okay, you can organize it a little bit better. And I think that happens anytime you get people together to fix a problem. You put a whiteboard in the room, you tend to get the solution a little bit quicker and more efficiently than if you're just, spitting ideas out of your head and not really keeping notes. Make sense?
True story. I just did the same thing this morning. I've been, kind of envisioning this project in my head. And this morning I was like, okay, like I'm forgetting pieces of the project because I've been keeping it in my head for too long. So I just started brain dumping it down, and it all came together a lot quicker as I was putting it down on paper. So that's great advice, Steve.
Yeah, even if you don't have the paper and pen handy, you have one of man's greatest creations in your pocket, these smartphones with little note apps in it. You can just write stuff down in there, and keep it for reference for later on.
Right.
I do that all the time.
I'm not sure if you can hear behind me. Somehow, being the only person in the house, the printer just started turning on and printing something.
Oh yeah, mine does that too. It's usually somebody else signed into your computer, printed something, turned it off, and then the next person who turns it on, it just starts spitting stuff out. That happened to me yesterday.
Yeah, nobody's here to turn it on. I'm sitting here with a mic in my hand, and it just comes on behind me and starts printing something. So I'm not sure if you guys heard that, but that was that noise.
Oh, maybe yours is haunted. I don't know.
We've thought that before. My wife was taking a nap on the couch the other day, and a single guitar string was plucked.
Ooh, creepy.
Not like, the guitar shifted and the guitar made noise. It was one single guitar string, and it was plucked. I don't think she's fallen asleep on the couch by herself since. So, so Steve, we're going to wrap this up with your thoughts on breeding. I know life has thrown you a curveball, and you've had to step away from the breeding classes you were taking. But share with our audience your thoughts about where you were on that project and where you planned on going with that project a little bit.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I got into breeding. I think I talked about it a little bit last time, so I'm not going to go too far into that. But when I first started getting into breeding, and like I'm learning a little bit at the commercial facility, I'm learning a little bit through grad school, and I'm learning a little bit through my own readings. I was coming across conflicting pieces of info, and then also kind of learning how much the black market industry had picked up of that knowledge that's already being used in places like corn and soy. How much of it is already there, how much of it needs to be put out. And that was one of my goals, was to go through this grad school program and just basically pump that info out into the open space, because the more that stuff goes into the open space now, the less that Bayer Crop Science and DuPont can pick up when the national descheduling happens and then claim all that crap as IP. So if you're a smart dude out there and you're studying this stuff, guys like Kevin McCunin, and they're just putting this into the open space, it is doing us a really huge advantage in the sense that right now we have a gray market. Bayer Crop Science, and by the way, stop calling it Monsanto. It's not Monsanto anymore. It's Bayer Crop Science. Like, the longer they have this hemp genome while the market's gray, they're going to be working on this stuff too. The only thing they're missing is THC synthase. They can't work with that. Probably the first thing they're going to work on is safe hemp. When you harvest and you take it down and it's at 0.2%, it cures for a while and now it gets to 0.4. Now you don't have hemp anymore. So what they're probably going to end up working on is using, CRISPR-Cas9 or agrobacterium to go in and turn off THC synthase, such that now they can patent a hemp variant that's not going to, go bad on you while it's sitting in stock. If they do that before we do, if they roll that out before we do, they'll patent it, and that'll be one of they'll make royalties on it, all that other stuff. And, Jordan's had people talk about the IP stuff on Growcast before. So if anybody is curious about that, I recommend either listening to those episodes or reaching out to somebody like, Dr. Reggie Gradino over at Steep Hill Labs, because he used to do IP law before he got into genomics, and, he's a whiz on all of that stuff. So like I said, the more we can put out now while the market's gray, the less weaponry they have when the national DSCED comes. And I mean, that's going to come, and they're going to get in, they're going to make a whole lot of money when that happens. So just something I encourage. And on the breeding side, there's a lot we can put out now into the open space before it can become patentable. And I think enough people are doing that. But there's other approaches too outside of breeding. And, going back to what we were talking about with deficiencies and stuff, I'm a geospatial analyst. One of the things I'm looking at right now is using drones and multispectral imagers in outdoor plots to basically look at crops from overhead in a three-dimensional model in multiple different portions of the EM spectrum. And what that's going to do is, when you can visually see things in the infrared channel by collecting that data in that wavelength and then reprojecting it in our red, green, blue, which you can do with these geospatial programs, you can see deficiencies show up in the plant tissue before they show up visually. And so being able to throw a drone overhead and just map everything and say, okay, this part of the field is water, has a little bit of drought issues going on. This part of the field, is probably a little bit low on nitrogen. You're going to be able to do kind of a smart ag. And a lot of these companies are just kind of like waiting to get in on that. And the more that we can put it out now, the less advantage we give towards a company that's looking to take a monopoly. With breeding specifically, there's a lot of things that we could be breeding for that we're not. And one example that I learned of reading in a foreign policy magazine of all places was research being done at SDSU, San Diego State University. I can't remember the researcher's name, but she's basically looking at increasing suberin production in the root networks and the plant tissue. Suberin, I read about it in Jeff Liljenfeld's book. I can't remember exactly what it's supposed to do on top of my head. I want to say it has to do with like toughening up the plant tissue such that it makes it more rigid. but that is like a huge sink for CO2 within the plant's physiology. So the more suberin, like let's say you started if you made a big breeding program and your goals for the breeding program were, hey, I want to make the most environmentally friendly crop, which is something we really do need to think about in addition to soil regeneration, is how we are going to breed this crop for, to become more eco-friendly. And you can do that. You can design a breeding program to pump out low feeders such that you get a better yield to input ratio, right? That was one of the things I was going to work on. Give me more for less, such that even the people who are using conventional can at least use less of it. So say you end up with less NPK in the water beds and all that, and it goes into the ocean, takes away oxygen and kills fish stocks. That's probably like the big issue with using commercial fertilizers, is that effect. That and a number of other things that have to do with soil longevity. So it's not just about keeping, the soil healthy and the soil alive. We got to think about how we're going to breed this plant for the future in the face of things like, global climate change. You're also going to want to increase productivity, because the ethical issue comes up with respect to, this is something that the Texas A&M folks brought up that I hadn't even thought about. When I was looking for grad advisors, the big thing I was worried about was nobody was going to want to touch cannabis because they don't want to put their NIH or NSF funding at, risk. What I ended up finding out was that there were scientists that didn't want to touch it because they were worried that as cannabis moves outdoor, it's going to take arable land that is dedicated to food production. And so once you scale this thing up to a large enough, stop thinking about just the US and Canada are smoking. Start thinking about global production, the way that we produce wheat.
Totally.
And once you scale this thing up.
Can I jump in here just for a second?
Yeah, go for it.
It's not just cannabis, and it's not just land, it's resources. When hemp really boomed last year and there were all these licenses, I talked to farmers that were not planting squash or corn or peas or strawberries because they were using their land to farm hemp because they thought it was going to be more profitable. And I don't think we've seen a hit yet, but as CBD and hemp and cannabis begin to bloom, it's not just going to be the land. It's going to be the people that are willing to do that goddamn work.
Water
farming is, that outdoor farming is. Not everybody's cut out for that shit. And even if it's just 10% of the land, it's going to be 20 to 30% of the resources. Job. And what's that going to do to our food costs? I mean, we're already increasing the world's population, but we've reduced the amount of food that is output, and now our food costs are go up 20, 30, 50%. I mean, who knows? I imagine the people at Texas A&M have a guess. What do they have to say about it? Yeah, please.
I'll scare the shit out of you further. So organic commodities fetch a higher price at the market than commercial, like non-organic commodities.
Right.
And farmers in the developing world are picking up on this. So they are saying to themselves, I will use a lower yielding method, even though it may produce qualitatively better food and healthier food for us to eat. I will use a lower yielding method, which means out of the 38 or however many acres I have, I'm going to squeeze less out, but make more in the sale. So think about Brazil, a country like Brazil that is sitting on top of so much ag land that they're not using because they have amazing water tables beneath the surface. If they want to, if they think it's profitable enough, they will chop down the entire rainforest and plant organic crops because that's the most profitable way that they can squeeze that land out.
Right.
Now they'll get profits out of it. Will they be getting supply out of it? Not as much, which means that commodities are again, affected. As the population approaches 10 billion by 2050, you're increasing the demand and lowering the supply on a global scale. And so that has impacts both in terms of commodity pricing and it has impacts in terms of the environment. How many trees are you going to clear out and turn into ag land? And I don't care how healthy the soil is, how many microbes you pack it with, a cleared out field with crops on it is not going to sequester the same amount of CO2 that a healthy rainforest or a healthy mangrove system, off the coast is going to do.
Right.
And at one point I was thinking about doing that too, like going down to places where there's mangroves, which sequester 5 times the amount of carbon that, mature tropical forests do in, the Congo. These things suck in a whole lot of CO2. And if we could figure out a way to do like natural aquaponics where you graft cannabis plants onto like, mangrove root systems. I'll bet you get crazy terp profiles off of it, and it would be regenerative, and it would be good for the environment. So that was just like one avenue of tinkering that I was, thinking about going down. But stuff for folks to consider is those things in terms of both breeding and organics, breeding for better environmentalism, and really thinking about what organics is going to do to both the price market and the environment when you scale that up. And all of a sudden now you get better quality, but lower yield. And so I'm really happy for folks like Rizo Rich, Chris Trump, and all of them, like a lot of these KNF folks, they're reducing the environmental impacts of the globalized market in the sense that you're trying to localize production such that you don't have to ship these things all over the place, which reduces, the CO2 output of the shipping industry. And that's all well and fine. You're increasing the CO2 absorption of the soil by making it a living regenerative soil. A lot of good stuff with that. The only thing I'm asking is look at land cover, land use change. I'm a geospatial analyst. I look at these things on satellite imagery in the NDVI channel. Basically a band that is designed to look at how far vegetation extent covers the earth. We have satellites that collect this data. We compile them into data sets, and then we look at time series maps, 1950, 1960, 1970. You will see the decline of forest extent over time as ag production goes up. So I worry that when we start chucking hemp and cannabis plants outside, what's going to happen to food production? What's going to happen to CO2 sequestration? All these other things that we don't think about. Now, is there a great alternative solution? I don't know. Maybe that entails doing indoor vertical farming, being hooked up to nuclear reactors or something like that. Something that's carbon neutral. But, that'll be for somebody smarter than me to figure out. I'm just putting this info out there to get people thinking about it. You know what I mean? I don't want to see what happened to the ozone layer happen to food production. And the ozone layer was a case study in how solution for problem A causes problem B, in the sense that we stopped using CFCs in refrigerants and we started replacing them with HCFCs. Now, HCFCs don't deplete ozone, but they're a heck of, I'm talking about orders of magnitude more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So we fixed the ozone problem. We put all these HCFCs into the atmosphere that are showing up in the, Arctic ice samples now for the last 20 or 30 years. And, we basically helped, kick global warming along. So I don't want to see the solution to the regenerative soil issue then, cause a problem in another area. So that's just something for me to put out there for folks to think about, coming both from a geospatial perspective and from, folks who have been doing plant breeding decades longer than, I have attempted to, talking about these things. And I think they are serious issues. But with breeding, just a couple of entry tips for people who are just starting out learning this thing. Two things are really important. Think outside of dominant and recessive gene types, because when you get into multiple genes or quantitative traits like plant height, things like that, you're not just talking about dominant versus recessive. And when you think about a phenotype as a collection of, trait expressions that came out due to kind of statistical chance, they're all very unique. And so when you find that keeper, when you find that plant that you want to breed with, you want to do a few things with it first. I would recommend immediately doing some test crosses. Now, you can either do a test cross via a self, like you can self the plant. You take the silver colloid or wherever you're going to do, you reverse the sex, you pollinate itself. And via self-pollination, you're going to see the statistical frequencies and the ratios in that F1 and F2 progeny. And you're going to say to yourself, okay, I have a 3-to-1 phenotype expression in this one specific trait. What that's going to tell you is that you're either going to have a 1-to-1 ratio at the genotype level, and this is going to sound very confusing to some folks, but basically what I'm saying is, even though you see a 3-to-1 ratio in purple to green buds or something like that when it expresses, that doesn't mean that you have a plant that is, it's definitely not true breeding for that trait, which, you use the term heterozygous to describe. That means that even though I'm expressing purple, I carry the gene for green as well. And, there might be like a 50-50 or a 2-to-1 chance that my offspring produces the green. So determining how true breeding your potential parent stock is for that specific trait you're looking for. Remember, we're going back to requirement, process-driven breeding here. Let's say purple buds mixed with good yield, mixed with, a certain trichome head size, mixed with something else. You want to find out the heterozygosity or homozygosity of that trait in that plant. This way, when you plan out the F1 and F2 generation in the next cross, you have an idea of what ratios you're going to look at in the offspring, in the successive offspring. You're going to say, okay, I should see this ratio of trait expression in the next gen. If not, what does that tell me about this thing? There can be trait masking, there can be codominance, there can be a whole lot of things that go on. And as you learn about these things when you get into the breeding game, just take these genetic concepts that you'll learn about, like how quantitative traits are expressed and things like that, gene stacking, how one gene can affect another. It gets very complicated outside of, just simple Mendelian inheritance.
Mm.
But yeah, for new breeders getting in, once you learn this stuff, really think about how to use, what's available to you to determine, to pre-plan those ratios, I would say, rather than just chucking the pollen or taking something like, okay, I know this pheno is really popular and this cut's really popular. If I cross them, this thing's going to sell really well. What you really want to do is start with your requirements. Okay, I want a plant that does X, Y, Z. Start with about 5 without using stuff like transgenics or cisgenics. 5 is a pretty good baseline for trait, packaging, because going outside of that, 1 is going to take things like genomic analysis, and we don't have all the markers for that yet, or post-harvest chemotyping, which not everybody can afford. So if you don't have that data available, you really need to think about it before you start throwing pollen on everything, because otherwise you're going to end up with weird ratios down the line. You're going to say, how the heck did, this plant that I was trying to stabilize and back cross end up like this? If you don't think about the phenotype, genotype ratios, and those are 2 very different things. Like I said, you can have a 3-to-1 phenotype ratio, and what you're really seeing underneath the books, underneath the cover in the genotype is a 1-to-1 ratio, in the sense that you have 1 pheno out of the 4 that true breeds for that trait. You're talking like big A, as opposed to like the heterozygous 2 in that 1-to-1 ratio. That's going to be big A, little a. Those are going to be mixed, and they're not going to be true breeding for the next gen. If you were to self them, you'll get like some kind of distribution that'll approach 50-50 if you were to self those, depending on dominance and that kind of thing. And then you'll have that other one, which is your true breeding recessive. So just know that, if you self a plant, you plant 4 of those seeds and you see, something like a 3 green and 1 purple, that 1 purple is probably going to be your true breeding recessive. One of those 3 greens is going to be your true breeding green, but the other 2 are going to be a mix. And even though it looks like that, that's not what translates to what's going on under the books in the genome. Make sense?
Yeah, that's all good stuff. That's really good stuff. We are coming up on another hour that we've just spent together, so I'm going to wrap things up here. A couple things that I wanted people to think about was, Steve was talking about the trade-off of organic gardening and what that's going to do to our food supplies. I'm going to leave you with a couple thoughts, and if Steve has a quick thought to chime in. I read a really interesting article about GMOs and what genetically modified foods have done to our food supply. And I'm not going to throw out stats because I don't remember them exactly, but there's a bunch of pushback on GMOs, and I think for some good base, but without them, what I was reading is that our crops would not be nearly as hardy, productive, and safe to eat, because they would be riddled with more diseases and molds and stuff, because we've kind of bred them to be resilient against that our food supply would be a fraction of what it is today. So keep that in mind, with trade-offs and such, and do some research, read about this stuff. And, go ahead. Did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, one thing I would add to that real quick is that don't think about GMO in terms of transgenics and cisgenics. And, there's a lot of things they can do for us, but also consider that like companies like Bayer Crop Science, like how they're using this technology. Just because the technology exists doesn't mean on its own it's bad. Right. How it is employed can make it bad. And when you spray down things just so that, you put in the Roundup Ready gene so that you can spray it with glyphosate, that is very different from using, transgenics. When I talk about transgenics versus cisgenics, there's a difference between moving genes with agrobacterium or CRISPR-Cas9 from one cannabis plant to another, or one cannabis to hemp plant. Moving it into something like corn or something like that is when you get into transgenics. Now you're talking about frankenplants. When you're just talking about moving genes, within the same species from one plant to another, what you're doing is you're speeding up the breeding program. Like these things like agrobacterium and CRISPR-Cas9, these are naturally existing processes. Bacteria naturally do this. And so for me, organics largely comes down to a matter of degree. Can you build your own soil, stick a seed in there, plant it, and then do all these other things that require human intervention? You want to talk about biomimicry and things like that, but how much biomimicry is there when you're not using indigenous microorganisms? You're taking cocktails of bacteria from all around the world and you're throwing it into, a soil that doesn't exist in its natural state until you made it that, you know what I mean? Like this is all arguments of degree. So that's just something I want people to keep in mind when we talk about the GMO debate. If you keep drawing a smaller circle around your group, and when I say your group, I'm talking about the pre-descheduled cannabis market. If you keep putting a circle around your group and you tell all the people coming out of these PhD and graduate programs, hey, you're on the other side, you're with those people in Bayer crop science, guess what? You're giving Bayer the army it needs to dominate the market. And what I'd rather see is us bring those people in, see how we can use them in a sustainable way to do things like use, transgenics to help with environmental problems as opposed to create them. For me, it's more of a debate about business practices and how you're going to use that technology as opposed to just, demonizing the technology. That makes sense?
Yep. Perfect. Obviously Steve knows more about this stuff, definitely on the scientific level, but I urge you to do some research about this, GMOs. And I was just doing some quick research. Steve mentioned that the world population was expected to be almost 10 billion by 2050.
Current projections.
Yeah,
Things
current
can change,
projections.
wars happen.
Yeah, current projections. So I was just reading a quick article. Latest reliable number is 7.5 billion in 2017, and they're projecting 9.8 billion. 9.8 billion. That's an increase of like 25% over our current population in the next 30 years. That is outrageous to me. That is such an immense amount of growth.
Now go back in time, and what you're going to realize is we hit our first billion right around the year 1900.
Yeah.
And all the growth between now and then has been exponential.
Yeah.
Now we're adding a billion about every 12 years or something like that.
Yeah, and it's slowing down. The article I was reading is they projected to be 11.2 by 2100. So between, 2050 and 2100, that's only an increase of 1.4 billion because fertility rates are expected to go down.
That's not a good thing. You know why? Because what that describes is the undeveloped world developing to the point where kids are expensive as they are in places like the US. Now you don't have as many of them because they cost too damn much. And you end up at like kind of a break-even point.
Totally. And I don't know how you feel, Steve, but, this Mother Earth of ours can only support so many people.
Right.
China's done away with a one-child rule, and I don't want to ever get to the point. But, we only have one child. We're not replacing ourselves. And I think let's have 6 kids is not becoming the norm. I don't even think people have that passion around making sure that they at least replace themselves or put 2 kids out in the world for each person. I think that's going away. And I'm one of those. I'm totally fine with population reduction worldwide if it's done mindfully and not from a plague or the coronavirus or war or what have you. So
yeah, you have to be careful about it even in the peaceful scenario, because if you look at what Japan's got going on with their demographic inversion, they don't have, and we're going into a place where the baby boomer generation is retiring and the replacement generations aren't as high, which is why immigration is critical, because you're going to need that labor to make up for labor shortages down the road. But in Japan, they don't have that. They're a very isolated society. And so now they're building robots to take care of old people. I'm not kidding. You can Google that.
Oh, but that's happening anyway, Steve. And I would couple that with another trade-off conversation that we're already eliminating jobs because, we're automating things.
Yeah.
You go to a convenience store and you can check yourself. It's not even a grocery store. You can check yourself out at Cumberland Farms now. So with that trade-off, though, needs to come upskilling our workforce. It's not a matter of our unemployment is the lowest it's been in forever. And that's because, there are more jobs than people that are looking for them. But there's not enough skilled labor out there. And that's where I think we need to pick up the pieces, is upskilling our workforce to do more than just flip burgers and cash people out.
Correct. And I mean, the companies have thought this out, and there's one of two ways you can do it via the responsive market. Is you can either ship those jobs overseas and take advantage of the cheap labor there, where all the profits that they make as workers go into that country, or you can bring those workers here. If you're not, already training up that workforce, you can bring them here, pay them, and then their salary goes to the U.S. tax collection system. Their spending goes into the U.S. economy via, purchasing power. So to me, in terms of just pure economics, like immigration makes way more sense than just overseeing jobs. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, some things for you guys to think about and to chew on. We went way over time, way off tangents.
Yeah,
I really appreciate you all listening. Steve, where can people find you on Instagram? What is that handle again?
Right. So you can find me on IG at Sativa Steve _303. Always open to DMs. So I'll shoot the shit with you if I'm available at the moment. If not, I'll get back to you.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, audience, for listening. And if you enjoyed what you heard, make sure you give us a rating, review, subscribe, share, tell a friend, send out some carrier pigeons, smoke signals, whatever you want. Just make sure you're helping us get the show out there so we can continue to help growers just like you, get better at growing better cannabis and better medicine for you and your friends. Until next time, this is Steve and I signing off. Happy growing.